Our guest today is Judy Krieger. I met her at the 40th conference for Crypto Judaic Studies in Los Angeles, and she mentioned this gentleman I never heard of, which is Pablo de Burgos or Solomon Ha Levi. And then turns out that I got my genealogy back, and it says that he was one of my great uncles. And he converted to Christianity by force under Isabella and King. Was it Ferdinand, the name of the king?
No,
Was
that's not when he converted. He
Oh,
converted about 100 years before they came into power.
100 years before. So who was the king at that time?
The king, well, let's see. His name was Solomon Ha Levi, and in 1379 he was still a Jew, and the king, I believe it was John I, appointed him to be chief rabbi of Burgos. He was still a Jew, and he remained a Jew until 1391. During which or after which he converted to Christianity. And you might not say by force. There were starting in the early 1400s, early to mid 1400s, there were many violent pogroms that were taking place in Spain, starting in the south, mostly starting in Seville, and eventually reached to Burgos, where Solomon Ha Levi lived. And the pogroms, they mostly had to do with sort of same old. The Jews had positions that people coveted. They were administrators, they were doctors, they worked for the government because they had skills. There was another main feature why they were so mad and hated.
They were kind of friendly. Because they were successful.
They were successful, and wait a second, let me get my note here. They were another big thing in those decades before the huge riots of 1391 was that they were money lenders, and they were tax collectors. Thank you, dear. And tax collectors. And the irony is that those were two professions which, especially the tax collectors, which all the monarchs and the churches and the aristocrats, they needed people to collect monies for them for taxes, but nobody that was being approached to have their taxes collected was happy about it. So they were unpopular for that reason, and money lenders because the Christians couldn't lend money and they did it. And so that was one factor which factored into the growing anti-Semitic riots that led up to 1391, which was here. I'm talking. My husband wants to.
Before we move forward, that is an accusation that keeps coming up about the usury, and I just want to clarify. Based on the Torah and the Jewish tradition, lending money is not the problem. Is lending money unjustly, like asking for exorbitant amounts of interest, is what is frowned upon. And now there's this, Jewish trope that Jews keep doing it, that because Jews are accountants and financiers, and because they're involved in, financing wars and stuff like that, that they're still doing it, and that's justification for the ongoing anti-Semitism and hatred. So even back then, of course, like you said, nobody wanted to do it. So then they gave the worst jobs to the Jews, and then they became good at it, and then they got blamed for being good at collecting taxes, or lending people money. So it's a never-ending cycle of anti-Semitic hatred. But you said that he didn't I would, from my experience, I would say that they don't have to put a sword to your neck. They don't have to threaten to kill your family or torture you to convert to another religion. All they have to do is make it so miserable and impossible to survive that you have no other options. Do you feel that's what happened to Pablo or Solomon?
Not to him per se, but you're absolutely right with regard to a lot of other conversions. The pogroms, which I've been mentioning, which started in sort of early to mid 1400s, they were violently attacking all sorts of Jewish communities, and for the reasons like money collectors, tax collectors. They had all the positions that other people wanted. But also a big item there was the spoils. People, when they attacked the Jewish communities, they were very big on stealing their, precious metals, be it the candlesticks or whatever other metal objects. And so a lot of them did, as a matter of fact, as the 14th century unfolded leading up to 1391, a lot of them did convert at the point of a sword. They were being attacked in their community and they were brought to their knees, and a lot of them just said, okay, I'd rather convert than die. That was the case with a lot, but not with Pablo de Santa Maria or Solomon Ha Levi. He was in Burgos at the time when these pogroms reached Burgos. It took them, months and months to get from Seville to Burgos. I will just make one little comment about Seville. One of the most horrible attacks happened in Seville because one of the things which the church was doing along these decades was to require that the Jews live in communities, and they were only allowed to have one door to go in or to go out. And in Seville, it happened that there were about at one point there were about 4,000 Jews that were just absolutely the hordes ran in and charged into the city, walked into the synagogues, walked into the homes, walked into the streets, and just killed 4,000 Jews in Seville alone. And this was, I think, like 1440-ish that time. And this sort of thing, I mean, there was a lot of anti-Jewish preaching going on also. This was the century before, at the end of which Ferdinand and Isabel united the provinces of the Iberian Peninsula. And so the anti-Semitic behavior was just growing and growing. The joy in getting spoils, all the traditional anti-Semitic remarks. In other words, it was not enough that they were tax collectors and that they had all the best jobs, and that they also, I was going to say, the preachers at that time were upping their dialogue to the effect that they were preaching that the Jews are sons of demons and asses, and they have bad blood, and that if you intermarry with a Jew or even a converso, your blood will be considered impure, and these limpieza de sangre, which I'm sure you're familiar with that term, cleanliness of the blood, was just an ongoing accusation. And in fact, at the end of the century, when Ferdinand and Isabel became the reigning monarchs, after that and the discovery of the Americas, you had to theoretically prove to be Jewish on all cuatro costados. In other words, your four ribs or your four grandparents supposedly had to be known to be not Jews. And of course, a lot of Jews did go to the New World, and as a matter of fact, or converts, the Inquisition followed them, and the last auto de fe, or burning at the stake, took place in 1821 in Mexico. So the Inquisition, which was established in 1478 in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel asked the Pope to allow them to have an Inquisition there. It lasted, imagine, David, until 1821, which is pretty incredibly horrible.
Well, going back to Pablo, so what happened to his wife and kids when he became a priest? Because when you convert, you're saying that not only you're a suspect because you have Jewish ancestry, not only you were a rabbi with a family, and now you become a monk-like, clergy for the Catholic Church. What happens to all your connections? What happens to all your family? What happens to your beliefs? The whole concept of crypto Jew is that someone can still have Jewish ideas and practices, even though pretending to be Catholic. Let's say that he was willing to become a Catholic and he believed in Jesus and everything. You still have a Jewish upbringing, and maybe they took him because he knew Hebrew and maybe Latin. So what do you know about his community once he went from one side to the other?
Okay, good question. Um, Many of his intellectual peers looked down upon him. They were, I don't remember their names at the moment, but there was a good deal of consternation as to what he had done, apparently of his own free will. He did, as a rabbi, he also is thought to have known Latin and to have read a lot of the Christian theology, excuse me. And what happened to his family, I spent literally 2 years doing research, including going to Spain, etc. Every book that I think had anything in it about him, and no one is really able to say in detail for sure what happened. But he did leave his wife. She did not convert. Some people say that she did, but I don't think that's the case. She did not convert. He put his 5 kids in a local monastery, which my husband and I actually visited in Burgos. Um, and they were raised there. And he went to Paris. He went to the University of Paris and got his degree in Christian theology. And at the time, he also became friends with Pedro de Luna, who was a rich aristocrat from Aragon. And he became Pope Benedict XIII, the anti-pope in Avignon. So
Wow.
Pablo and he had a very long ongoing relationship. And, you know, it every scholar that I've ever read about says that Pablo converted sincerely, that he did comprehend all the arguments that the Jews traditionally had with the Christians with regard to the coming of the Messiah and all the transition, you might say, of the Hebrew Bible um, uh, ideas versus how they got uh, what's the word? There's a word for it, but I can't think of it. How they got translated into the New Testament.
But what about your book?
So, um, but what I was going to say is, all right. So, all the scholars that I've ever met with are quite certain that he decided that the Christian beliefs were actually the true ones, and that the Jewish beliefs were not. And so, uh, you can only have your opinion, or in other words, he grew up, I think he was, let's see, he converted in 1391 and he was born in 1353. So he maybe late 20s when he converted. And uh, I mean, he had a pretty thorough Jewish education, to say the least, and he was considered to be very intelligent. And so his conversion by the Catholic Church he was considered to be an illustrious converso and a role model. And that if Shlomo Ha Levi could convert, um, so should all you Jews uh, that are left behind. So he died having been um, deemed an archbishop. I mean, he functioned as the Bishop of Burgos for many years, where he had been the chief rabbi of Burgos. He lived most of his senior life as the Bishop of Burgos, and just around the time that he was dying, or shortly thereafter, they elevated him to the uh, rank of Archbishop. And there's a few Hebrew documents that exist after one before he converted and one after he converted. Oh, yes, dear.
What about the
My husband wants me to say about the Magen David uh, in the cathedral. Have you ever been to Burgos, Spain, David?
No.
There's a huge cathedral, not surprisingly, there, and there's actually two on one of the entrances, not the main one, but on one of the entrances to the cathedral, there are two Magen David stars.
very large?
Yeah, and the guidebook that I bought said that it's possibly a um, tribute to the respect for their intellectual colleague, whom they knew was a Jew, as a respected Jew, and who became an illustrious Christian convert, some concession to him, or just to show in general that at the time of the construction, which I'm sure was a couple of hundred years, that the Christians and the Jews were in good relations. But it's very conspicuous.
You mentioned two Hebrew documents. What did they say after his death?
Well, the first one was a kind of an elegant responsa letter. It's called the Purim letter, and he was a rabbi at the time, and that he wrote it. And some say he was actually in prison at the time. It's probably not the case, but at the time that he wrote it, he was in England or in some English territory in France, and it was Purim time, and he wrote, it was very, you may know that responsive literature, part of it is straight discussion of debates about certain parts of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, they debate, what does this mean about kosher? What does that mean about, different topics? This one is a kind of an elegant piece of literature, which was very common in those days, where, let's say, the rabbi of Prague would write something to the rabbi of Paris, and he would show that he knew how to, he knew all the phenomena of biblical literature. Most rabbis knew the Old Testament by heart, so they could intersperse such things in their works, which he did in this piece. After, the only Hebrew document that exists after he converted is a letter that he wrote to his former student, Joshua Ha, who, having been Shlomo Ha Levi's student, Joshua Ha wrote a letter to his former teacher, Shlomo Ha Levi, who was now Pablo de Santa Maria. And Ha said, how can you do this? Everything you taught me, you are now saying is not true. And he went through a very traditional scholarly type of letter, using all sorts of biblical proofs to suggest that, all the defenses of the Jewish ways of looking at things. And Pablo's response was it's in my dissertation in translation. Pablo's response was kind of like, sorry, my Hebrew's a little rusty now, but it was just like very, not very compassionate, dismissive, that's the word. And but later on, Joshua Ha, not too many years later, he also converted to Jerónimo de Santa Fe, who became one of these excessively intense neophyte converts, and was very, very negative and zealous against his former Jewish colleagues. So
let's talk about your fictional book. Do you portray him as a heroic figure, a divided man, someone who's troubled and confused, or just someone that went along with the trends of that time?
The first thing you said, in other words, I just could not personally feel like someone who had been a rabbi for half of his life and who was trained and so forth. I just couldn't feel that someone like that could take such a total reversal in his intellect and his emotions. So I portrayed him as someone who made the decision, left his wife. In my book, he and his wife were very close, put his children away, and that he got into the life of the royalty and became very, very high up in Christian court and in the monarchy. And as the book goes on, I portray him as being more and more and more and more regretful. And having died, he wrote a letter, what do they call it? Like a certain kind of a will. It's an oral will, which I think comes from the Torah, like when Jacob gave advice to his children what to do in their future. It's known as a kind of an oral will. And Pablo, in my book, writes an oral will kind of on his deathbed. He left a note on his chest because he was already, pretty tired. So he left a note on his chest that his daughter kept and read for my book, that he, he totally considers himself a hypocrite, a bad father, a bad husband, um, and I saw him. That's the way I wanted to portray him, contrary to all these scholars that, I mean, we met two of them, my husband and I. One was in Israel. His name is Yossi Israeli, and he's written a lot about Pablo de Santa Maria. And another one is a man who teaches, I think, at the University of Michigan. I can't remember. It's a Polish name, very hard to spell. But the scholars who have examined his Latin works, which he wrote after he converted, they're totally believing that his conversion was completely sincere.
Do you have a copy of your book?
I think David has seen my book. You saw it at the conference,
Well,
right,
you can
David?
Just show it, so.
Yeah.
Yes. So we can tell people how to get a hold of it at the end of the interview.
Okay.
So that moral will that you wrote, was it based on your perspective, or was there any hints of something like that being created by him?
It was totally my imagination.
It's interesting that
But I did look it up. In other words, there is a tradition of this kind of will, and usually the person writes it well in advance of his death for his family. But in my book, Pablo did not.
well, knowing a lot about hagiography, which is the stories of saints, you know how even in the Jewish tradition, they'll say that Rabbi Nachman or one of those guys that they could fly, they could perform miracles, they had visions and stuff like that. It's, the history is written by the fans or by the winners. So could it be that what we know of Pablo is what the Catholic Church wanted us to know versus what the Jewish community or his own family experienced? And it's also something that I've seen in my research is that is usually romanticized that Jews would martyr themselves instead of converting to Catholicism in Europe, in France and England and other places. But there's examples of people doing the same thing as Pablo for
Mhm.
different reasons. And there's even a theory that Maimonides pretended to be a Muslim for a time so he could survive. He went all the way to former Palestine to work for Salahuddin as his physician. So there was ideas in Spain that got picked up from the Almohads, the Moors, which is to pretend to be part of the culture and the religion that is prominent to survive, and then when you get a chance, you can escape and go back to practicing Torah. Was there any hints in your research or in your story that a lot of what he was doing was maybe protecting his family? Because as a priest, he was able to do confessions, and if anybody came and told him that they were practicing Judaism in secret, that he would not rat them out to the Inquisitional authorities or get them in trouble. Could that be a possibility as well?
Okay, the first part of your question was, repeat the first part. I was listening to the second part, and then
Is it possible that he was using taqiyya, the concept from Islam, where you become almost like a spy, a double agent?
okay. No. Okay, that's my opinion. The way scholars and scholarship portrays him, he was an absolute dead-on illustrious convert. I mean, he became, he rose quickly. He was given by Pope Benedict, Pedro de Luna, the anti-Pope Benedict. He was given many titles rather quickly on. And then he was the last thing that Benedict did before he died, or I should say before he was excommunicated and then died, was to appoint Pablo to be the Bishop of Burgos. And from everything that one could find in a history book about him, that's what he wanted.
This was also the time of the Babylonian captivity where they had two popes.
Yeah.
So that you could see that, let's put him in the front office, and when people come in and see this is a Jew that is now turned Catholic, hey, this is a good deal we got here.
Well, there were about 30-year period where there were two and perhaps even three individuals vying to be Pope. There was a Pope in Rome and then Pope Benedict in Avignon. And that was Pablo's Pope. And in the end, even Pablo, if I'm not mistaken, they had to excommunicate him, or whatever the right term was, because he refused to abdicate since um, he had become Pope on false pretenses because of this conflict of, and many popes wanting to claim the papacy. Benedict said that he would, if he was elected, that would be fine, but he would immediately resign, and then there could be only one pope standing, and he didn't do it. He did not. I think he died in, I want to say, I better not say because I don't remember,
No
but
worries.
he died still believing that he was pope.
What I was saying on the second part of my question is that one of the benefits of Judeo-conversos to become involved in the leadership of the Catholic Church was to protect family members and to help kind of put on a good show, so then their own family wouldn't be persecuted. I guess in his case that wasn't what happened, but was there hints of that in your book where you were saying that maybe he was trying to he was regretting what he did, and then he was also concerned about how other conversos would be treated and mistreated by the ongoing paranoia against Jews?
I didn't find anything like that in my research. And in my book, I didn't portray him as wanting to protect his fellow Jews. He did want to protect, he had one son, his second son, Alonso de Cartagena, who became a very, very important Catholic prelate. In fact, in the Burgos Cathedral, when you walk around and you see all these chapels, there's one huge chapel that is devoted to Pablo's son, Alonso de Cartagena, very important in the Catholic Church. And so Pablo was very, in real life, I don't know exactly how he behaved, except that I know he was very partial to his second son. In my book, I had him interact with his daughter before he died. And in my book, I said whom he didn't even visit one time when she was in the convent, his having put her there when she was like 6. But no, I do not know of anything in reality whereby he was trying to protect the Jews. On the contrary, kind of. He's not portrayed in a very positive light by historical books. As a Jew might be looking at him.
Well, I know that some of the converted Jews would be used as poster boys to go and convert the rest of the community,
Right.
and they would go inside synagogues and pick fights. Was he involved in that? Did he support that? Did he think it was good to evangelize, or did he want the Jews to be left alone and just the ones who are willing to come to the body of Christ?
I did not know of any time when he evangelized. He was such a higher up, and he was so involved in the royal court. I don't think he had time to evangelize per se.
What about Torquemada?
Ross wants to talk about Torquemada, the during the time of Ferdinand and Isabel, he was the chief, what do you call him? Inquisitor, yeah. He's in my book. I went after Pablo's death to finish off the century, so to speak, to the expulsion. And Torquemada, some rumors to the effect that he had Jewish heritage, just rumors. But your question was, did Pablo try to help other people to convert? Not he personally, but I think the church used him as a role model and said, the great rabbi of Burgos feels that that Jesus is the Messiah and
But he wasn't
Christianity.
involved in the Inquisition.
No, he died way before it was established. Pablo.
Are you familiar with Saint Teresa of Avila?
Yes.
In my research, her dad or her grandfather was persecuted by the Inquisition, and I don't know if he reneged his Judaism, but she was very devout and was even made into a saint.
Yeah.
So can you paint a picture of the 1,000-year like history of Jews in Spain, and what percentage of the population were Jewish at that point?
Well, I know that they arrived before the time of Jesus. I suppose they were traders and they would get to the coastlines. And at the time, like around the time of Jesus, there were not, let's see, the Romans had, I think, I forget when the Romans exactly came to the peninsula, probably early on, because they were already an empire 400 years BC. But the Romans were there, and then the Visigoths, the Germanic peoples, kind of conquered the Romans in Europe. Well, Venetians and Jews, right, but around the time of Jesus. But during the 1,000 years, it was the Romans were there. Then the Visigoths conquered the Romans on the peninsula. What we're talking like until maybe 700, 711, the Muslims invaded, and the Jews were there all the time, and they were never popular. It's the same old, same old. They had positions that people were jealous of because they had skills that the rulers needed. They were conveniently, it was a convenient reminder at all times that they had killed Christ. They were they were tax collectors and money lenders. And so it was the same round of activities, including making Jews live in neighborhoods away from Christians.
Ghettos.
Highly, overly taxed, assaulted at will. So, and really they, when the Visigoths were winding down, so to speak, because the Muslims were taking control, the Jews, they kind of helped the Muslims when they were trying to get into new territory. When the Muslims would conquer new territory, the Jews would say, "Okay, we'll watch it for you," and then the Muslims would go further north, and so they watched over the new territories. They served whoever was in power, sort of, in order to survive. But they were always unpopular, and in the blink of an eye, they could be accused of something, killed or something of that nature. But the 1,000 years was pretty much constant anti-Semitic activity, survival. Ultimately, 14th century was the worst, and at the end of that century, they were expelled. And there were something like 300 Jewish families at the time of the expulsion, but I would have to double check that.
So according to the internet, it was 10 to 15% of the population under Muslim rule were Jewish. I don't know afterward, but during the Roman Empire, 10% of the population was Jewish. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot of people. Now we're 1.5, 2% of the US and 1% of the world. So, there's people that believe that crypto Judaism is not real, that it was paranoia from the Catholics, that they would say everybody's a Jew, like they would say everybody's a Protestant, a heretic, or a witch. Right. And that there was no connection, that everybody was a sincere convert, kind of like Pablo. But new information has come up in the last 40 years, and we talked about that during the conference. Is there any other things that you find fascinating about his life that you want to share with us? What do you think was his, there's a story of, I think, a French bishop who was descendant from the Holocaust, that he was given to to a Catholic family so he could survive as a baby, and then he went up in the ranks and became a bishop or a cardinal. Do you think that like in Jewish law that someone is always Jewish no matter what they believe, or do you think that it's easily exchanged, like because it's a religion? It's although you can have heritage, you can be a descendant of Abraham, that people can just pick and choose their religion and move on, or is there something innately Jewish even about the way that he went about with his scholarly work as Archbishop? Bishop?
That's a good question. Actually, it's pertinent today, as you know, with the crypto Jews who are, once they've gone and checked out their ancestry and gone to Spain and done everything they could, there's been a big, I call it a scandal, if rabbis will not accept them, that they are convinced that they have found their ancestry to be that of Spanish Jewry. And my cat is making noise. And in those days also it was a big issue because the for example, if one had converted, in my book it comes up a couple of times, if someone had converted and then the characters are at the end of my book want to convert back to Judaism, and there were all sorts of rabbinical opinions on the matter, and then Rashi had an opinion, Maimonides had an opinion, and there was someone else in my book that I can't remember exactly, but Rashi was the one that, when all was said and done, it's a lot more complicated than I'm saying, but once a Jew, always a Jew. So if someone in your background was a Jewish mother, if your great grandmother was a Jewish mother, you've got her blood, and that is enough grounds to be considered to return to the faith. Not everyone accepted that, of course, but today it's a big issue, and it just made me so mad when I heard that in the earlier years of this conference that rabbis were taking issue with the idea that these people could not be taken back into the fold. It infuriated me.
Well, they'll say we'll take you back as long as you convert, which denies that they have any Jewish
Right. I think
legal status.
to me that's disgusting.
Well,
I want to be Jews, for goodness sake.
Well, I appreciate you being an advocate for our movement of return, not conversion. But when it comes down to Catholic and Jewish history in medieval times, I know that it goes back to the Visigoths, and the Visigoths, the Edict of Milan and different things like that. They made it politically dangerous to stay Jewish, and they made it where you had limited rights. So you mentioned pogroms. For people that are not familiar, they're just anti-Semitic attacks. And they say that this is when it went from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, when they kept on persecuting people even though after they converted, they had a beef against them. So maybe there was different branches of Catholicism, because if Pablo got a good rap and he was allowed to thrive, not everybody got that. And one thing that I came across was that they would say that we smell like sulfur because we were demonic, even though people were Catholic. So it's very troubling that it's kind of giving in to the hatred, not allowing for people to return. And then what I found out is that I'm a descendant of his sister, and their common ancestor is the father and the grandfather who was a rabbi. And what I find fascinating is that they were Levites, and then he went and became a Catholic priest. So the Levites were the priestly class in the Bible, and they helped Moses and Aaron build the tabernacle, and they were kind of like the troops that helped the Kohanim. So it's interesting that he pursued priesthood, a different type of priesthood through Jesus, but that there are some things that they have similarities between Catholicism and Christianity. Did you delve into the role of a priest in medieval Europe? I know they had a lot of power, even in Mexico nowadays. priests have like almost like a judge type of role, and they can make or break a governor, a mayor of a city. They have a lot of power. Do you think that played a role into his decision?
Well, what I experienced in my research was that they had a lot of power because they were preaching, and they were preaching poison. And the Jews, after they went, before they all converted or whoever did, the Jews would go to the synagogue, and then they would be required to go to the church to listen to the preachings of the priests, and they were very ugly preachings. And I don't know what power they had actually. I think the power was a little bit more spontaneous. In other words, if the priests riled up the congregants and they decided to have a riot that day and go riot in the synagogue and steal, and then go into the Jewish neighborhoods and burn houses down and take the spoils, um, that was not official power. The church, the people that spoke for the church, the higher ups, I think, more than the parish priests, had the power. And Pablo wasn't into that I know of. He was very busy at court until about 1421, and then he kind of got unpopular because he'd been on the wrong political side of what was going on at court. And so then he took more of a religious activity, wrote two very, very major theological works that have been analyzed by certain scholars. Scrutinium Scripturorum. It's in my book, all the works.
Tell us about his work as a royal chaplain. I was amazed to see that as someone who does that work nowadays. Was he doing spiritual counseling and guidance for this anti-pope, or how was the work as a chaplain
Good question.
related?
I think really what the chaplain did in those days, and we're talking around 1394, 95 and on, what they did was they kind of organized the priestly activities around the government and the court. I'm not sure how much of it was spiritual counseling, although he could have, because he was regarded, as I said, an illustrious convert. And I'm sure had that been, part of his job description, he did it. But it was mostly to take care of what was going on at court and to represent Benedict, who was not well liked by any of the European kings, really. Because he was illegitimate. He said he was going to resign and he wouldn't. But Pablo's activity at court, the chaplain's activity was to organize the religious personnel at court.
And I know it's hard to speculate, but did he mention any spiritual experiences? Because a lot of Christians and some Jews would say that the reason they hold to their beliefs so strongly is because they had a vision of one of the saints, of Jesus. God himself appeared to them and told them the right way. Is there any hints that he was having ecstatic, mystical experiences like Teresa of Avila?
No, not that I know of. I mean, he's portrayed all the literary historians and historians, they don't relate to that at all. I think Teresa of Avila, her situation was, when she was a woman, she didn't have a lot of power. And she, was perhaps the daughter, I don't know, remember in detail, but she was the daughter of a converso, and she was a conversa. And there's a lot of Jews would like to say that, she was having these psychological, I don't know what you call them, breakdowns or something, because she was tormented from her background. But that would be an interesting topic for someone to write about.
Well, what would happen is that they would have some type of almost romantic experience in the sense of they would start reading the Bible and they would start, dreaming of God or Jesus, and they would have these like very passionate experiences of love towards some type of manifestation of God. And then they would write about it or then make a painting about it, and it become a way to get the faithful to be more excited about their faith. It's kind of like in Hasidic Judaism where they made the spirituality very commonplace, and they made it more public.
Mhm.
So they use that as propaganda or as ways to get the faithful more excited.
Mhm.
I'm sure that Pablo was more an intellectual, and he
Yes.
spoke about it more, based on scripture and based on history and stuff like that. So it's interesting that that's a Jewish approach, an intellectual approach to faith is what we now connect with as modern Jews. But there was periods of time where a lot of mystical stuff was happening. And it's interesting that maybe he was also one of my battles with my family is fighting superstition. That Mexican culture is very superstitious, is very open to astrology and all kinds of weird stuff. And part of being an Americanized Jew is that I try to bring it back to what makes sense, what philosophically works for us, almost like a Maimonidean approach. So it would be interesting to read his works and see if he takes a more rational approach versus a mystical one.
He's I forget the words. It's polemics. They have these like the Jews and the Christians would be called by the Pope to, I forget, there was a big one in Tortosa, I think my husband had visited. Periodically, the Pope would call for an official debate between the Jews and the Catholics, or the Jews and the Christians. And it was not voluntary. The Jews were required to show up, and uh, there were these quote unquote intellectual arguments, polemical arguments about, how many criteria were met when Jesus was supposed to be considered the Messiah. The Jews had a whole set of arguments why not, and the Christians had a whole set of a bunch of arguments why he was to be considered the Messiah. And of course, the Jews always lost, but they were always intellectual based on knowledge of Torah and New Testament.
What about the Talmud? A lot of conversos who became inquisitors and missionaries for the Catholic Church, they would misuse and abuse the Talmud and say that some of the verses actually apply to Jesus, or that the Talmud is full of lies and presumptions, just like people do nowadays. Did you find any evidence of bashing Jewish tradition in the process?
Well, in my research, uh, anything written in the Talmud could never, what do you call it? Could never cancel out what was written originally in the Torah. In other words, anything in the Talmud could never, what's the word, top what was written in the Torah. The original Torah was always correct. However, although, for example, the Joshua Ha Levi, who became Jerónimo de Santa Fe, he did maintain that if it was written in the Talmud, it could trump what was said in the Torah. What do you call it? Very fundamental polemicists in Judaism never accepted that. But it was used, as you're saying. It was brought up. But I mean, it's commentary, so it's not, the original.
Authoritative or
Right.
well, that's interesting because that's some of the debates that happen now with the modern rabbis claim maybe not higher authority, but claim to have a little more understanding than the Talmudic rabbis, and then going back to the Bible. So there's a huge debate in tradition about that. Tell us about the process of writing the book. How long did it take you to write your dissertation and then writing the fictional book? And what has been the response from people for both of your projects?
Well, my dissertation, let's see, I took my PhD exams in 81, and I turned my dissertation in 88. The first 2 years, as I told you, was total research. And I was working full time as a school teacher. So it took me, let's see, 83 to 88 to actually finish the dissertation. And no problem. I mean, I was writing all the time, doing my teaching work and so forth. And then finally, as to writing the book, I just said, when I finally turned it in, I said, you know, someday I'm going to write a historical novel about this man. And I forgot about it for many years. And then one of my friends we were talking about our respective educations, and she said, you ought to write a book. And I thought, oh, yeah, I was going to. And so it took me all in all around 10 years, but I wasn't writing all the time. I was retired and I was playing tennis. But finally I started to really pound down on it. It probably took me 3 years to write it. And I love doing it. And I had to do a lot more research because I found out at first I only had 46,000 words, which in the publishing industry is not enough for a one book sort of. So I said, okay. So I decided to go beyond Pablo's death, which was in 1435. I thought, okay, I'll go up to the end of the century when the Jews were expelled, which made it more interesting. Anyway, I mean, there was so much, to be told about that. And one of my greatest sources was Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. He wrote, I mean, the book was so fat, it's so thick. I have it right here. The book was so thick, I had to break it up into 3 parts in order to handle it. Netanyahu's book on the origins of the Inquisition. But it's a absolute great research.
What has been the response of the people that have come across your book or your dissertation?
I self-published. I didn't, get it published by Penguin Random House or anything like that. And so many of my friends have read it. They seem to like it. I did what I wanted to do in the book. I wanted to include a lot of Jewish content and history and Spanish history because it was kind of the backbone of what was going on. And I wanted to imagine for myself what these characters were like. Like, you don't know about the people when you read books about, Pablo de Santa Maria, about medieval history. You have no idea what he was like. You can infer from certain things. So I made up, I mean, the characters, his daughter, his wife, his kids, I made that up for myself. And I wanted to express, as I said earlier, that he regretted it, that it was a terrible mistake.
Have you met people who have done something similar to him, that have changed faiths or grown up in a different faith, and they're happy and they say they can be Jewish and Buddhist, or Jewish and atheist or Christian at the same time? And do you see them as divided people, or do you see them as being able to hold both perspectives at the same time?
No one has come to mind, David. No. I mean, I used to live in West Los Angeles, and I mean, I just thought everybody was a Jewish Democrat, and when I lived in that end of town. And then when we moved out here to Ventura, I thought, oh, that's not the case at all. So I have not.
Because that's one of the challenges. I've met a couple of people who have crypto-Jewish background or converso background, and they'll say, I'm happy being Catholic, but I know I'm Jewish. Or there was one in the documentary they presented at the conference, and it makes both communities uneasy. But in the research we call it a complex identity, where people can hold to different things at the same time, and it can be contradictory or conflictive, but somehow they found peace in engaging in both perspectives. I think that some people have said that part of the American Jewish experience is that everybody has a little bit of everything because we're not a monolith anymore. So maybe it was that way in Spain because it was very complicated and very even dangerous to pick one side or the other.
Well, something that I found very interesting, this was from reading Netanyahu's book, is that by the time of the expulsion and the establishment of the Inquisition in 1478 in Spain, there were not that many Judaizers. Most of them, there were already, from 1391 on, there were already many generations of people that were conversos. They thought of themselves as conversos, and they weren't thinking about their Judaism. But the supposed, this is just one person's view, which I happen to accept, the supposed interest of the Inquisition was to accuse many people of Judaizing, and it didn't take much. I mean, it could be that your neighbor saw that you didn't have a fire in your chimney on, you probably know this, on Friday night or Saturday, and that meant you were Jewish because you weren't working, you were observing the Sabbath. Or if they saw you using the same butcher you used to use when you were Jewish, and now you're a converso, but you're still using your old Jewish butcher. So, but by the time of 1492, there were supposedly not that many people Judaizing, but the Inquisition had the practice of accusing people on, zero provable accusation of Judaizing, and then they would immediately bring them to trial, torture them usually, if not burn them to death, and then they would confiscate their property. And a lot of monies that were needed by the crown and the church went to the crown and the church from a lot of people that, I mean, they only persecuted rich Jews. They mostly persecuted rich Jews or conversos. And so I believe it. And when I found out that they followed the Jews to Mexico, the Inquisition, and that it was finally disbanded in 1821, I'm thinking 300 years of burning people to the stake, getting their money, getting their property. Pretty sickening.
We're gonna have to leave it at that. Can you tell us how people can get a hold of your book?
Yeah, just the title. It's Amazon. It's called Dreaming in Medieval: The Life and Times of Pablo Santa Maria. Dreaming in Medieval by Judy Krieger McPherson.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you for your time and for sharing about your book and your dissertation. Maybe we can have you in the future and go further into Benzion Netanyahu's theory that I don't agree with, and and we can go deeper into what can be proven, what can be discerned from what happened, and how did it all pan out. But again, we appreciate you sharing this very fascinating story of my uncle Pablo, and how this whole medieval history of the Jews in Spain went about. Thank you so much.
Very much, David. Enjoy.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.